is not legal or psychological advice. Listening does not create a professional relationship with Split Up or any guests. Lonnie and Robert are only licensed in the state of Arizona. For legal or mental health concerns, please consult a licensed professional in your state. Guest identities may be changed for privacy.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back. I am Lonnie Sheldon, your family law attorney here to advocate for solutions to co-parenting challenges.
And I'm Robert DiCarlo. I'm a forensic psychologist. My focus here is always on what's best for the child, especially when parents can't agree on issues.
All right, so together we created Split Up, and today we're talking about extracurricular activities and kind of managing those in high conflict co-parenting situations. And just a heads up, a note, Robert and I are disagreeing a lot in this. And I think a lot of it is because I'm such an advocate for my clients and he's, an advocate for the kids. Now, I know I should be an advocate for the kids, but that's not my job. And I'm just an advocate. That's who I am as a person. And Robert is, a psychologist who's, in touch with everybody. Like he gets it. He gets the kind of feeling. So we're probably going to be pushing some buttons today, and it's been an interesting conversation of us trying to figure this out. So let's go, Robert.
All right. Thanks, Lonnie.
All right. So one of the first things we want to talk about again is extracurricular activities and the disputes that often arise in them. If it's a high conflict situation and one parent wants the child in extracurriculars and the other parent doesn't want the child in extracurricular activities, a lot of this boils down to your parenting plan. And so one thing you're going to want to do is create a really good parenting plan. But parenting plans can't account for everything. They just can't. Every family's different. So Robert is, I think, going to help give us some tips. If not, I'll put him on the spot to give you guys some tips on what to do when there's a disagreement and a fight. Now, I was also asking Robert earlier to make some really strong determinations, and he really can't because we don't know all the dynamics of the family. So we'll try and give some examples and kind of see where it goes.
Yeah, exactly. And Lonnie, we talk about sometimes, these high conflict dynamics, and these dynamics exist when you have two parents or parties in a family who just can't agree on things, and things that should be fun, enriching experiences like extracurricular activities or sports or athletics for children can really turn into another venue in which the family uses as a battleground. So parents are not always going to see eye to eye on these topics. My focus, again, is always on the kids, but in working with people and families in a therapeutic setting, of course, I deal in the art of perspective taking. And so while one parent's perspective may be A and the other's is B, there's usually opportunities within that dynamic to explore solutions that really focus on the specific needs of the child or children.
Yeah, so I like that. Now, we both hear this. We both hear this all the time. Is everybody is a narcissist? Everybody is borderline. Everybody is alienating. Like we hear all these terms all the time. Does high conflict actually require a mental health issue, or can anybody be high conflict?
That's a fantastic question, Lonnie. So I get the same dynamic in my types of evaluations or expert work that I do. You have individuals coming in, parents who are non-mental health experts. They're often seeing traits or characteristics in their co-parent or partner that they quickly identify as being pathological or attached to some sort of mental health diagnosis. These are really complex issues, and sometimes a lay diagnosis of narcissism or borderline personality, it really detracts from the underlying issue, which is the conflict that's existing between the two individuals. And to answer your question, no, you do not have to have a mental health disorder or a diagnostic label to engage in high conflict behavior. Again, this is a dynamic we're describing. It's an interaction between two or more people based on context and circumstances. And with that said, you can have contexts and circumstances that create a conflict for two people, and those same two people are perfectly collaborative in another setting or context. So you really have to look around the issue and look at it from different perspectives and from different vantage points to really start problem solving.
Yeah, one thing that I have tried, I'm divorced. Everyone knows I'm divorced. I've said it on all the podcasts I've ever done. And I think it took a long time for me to learn that I'm not always right, and that there somebody else could be right, and we could actually both be right. Like, just because somebody thinks differently than me does not mean they're wrong. I still probably am sure my way is the best way, but there are other ways. And I think that's one thing that parents hopefully will learn if they haven't yet, but that's hard, especially in a divorce. But that is one thing I think that can cause high conflict, right? When you think that everyone's so sure they're right and their answer's best.
Yeah, that does tend to be one of the driving factors. The other piece is emotion. You're dealing with intensity. You have a situation in which a parent or a child says or does something that activates an emotional response, and suddenly you're no longer able to process in a way that might help you problem solve effectively. And your truth could be different than the other party's truth, and both things can be true or nothing can be true. So this, I think, is alluding to what you discussed earlier, Lonnie, that, we may disagree on certain perspectives because I'm coming from the place of maybe less advocacy and more problem solving, where your role with a client may be very well to win an argument and laying out the best possible case
Well, yeah, I'm trying to solve the problem for my client
for your
in the
client.
best way for my client. And with I mean, if I was mediating, sure, I'm going to give the other side some regard, but other than that, I'm going to fight for what I think or my client thinks is right. But it does remind me, and I did put notes down just so that you know, because I think you gave me a really great idea for another podcast, which was, well, a couple of them, mental health issues. So what does that mean?
Right.
Because it's your work in the problem, not the name of the mental health issue, which that took me a long time, even as a lawyer, to kind of understand and accept. So it's like, all right, you got a mental health issue, so what? Like, what is that? How does that affect the parenting? But the other one is when you're talking about triggers, you're saying something could trigger someone. I do want to do a whole podcast on triggers, because I think there's so many, and sometimes people do them purposefully, and sometimes people just don't know how to handle them. And so we're definitely going to want to do the triggers one also, and talk to people about how to best not trigger somebody, at least certainly not purposefully if they don't, unless they're high conflict and they want to. But we're going to talk about how not to trigger, and things that they can do. I think that would be a good one.
Yeah, and I would argue even more importantly is you're always going to get triggered by something. It's how you respond and what tools you use to ensure you're back on track and working in a cooperative manner with your co-parent in the best interest of your children. It would be
And
unrealistic
two
to
sides of
expect
the same
us.
coin.
Yeah, right. And it would be unrealistic to expect not to feel an emotion when something difficult comes up.
Right. Okay. So for today, and I know I took us down a rabbit hole, which I do. We're talking about extracurricular activities, and these are hard. These are, I didn't realize how hard these were until Robert and I were walking through them, and just really big different opinions. So one of the things that we have happen regularly as divorce attorneys is, some parent, there's an issue with extracurriculars, right? So there's maybe in the parenting plan, it says the parties will, share the cost of any agreed upon extracurricular activities. Or it says something like, parties must agree on curricular activities. And so it doesn't necessarily say if it interferes with the other parent's parenting time or things like that. And so there's a lot of ways to kind of mess that up. And that's kind of one of the things we want to solve here. And one of the things we try and solve in split up. Again, we can't account for every single issue, but we do want to address some. So I'm going to put some examples to Robert and kind of get his feedback. So the first one is it's my time, right? It's my time to do what I want to do with the child. So the classic one where there's a situation where mom and dad, share custody, and little Ava is super excited about gymnastics, but her meets fall on dad's weekends, and dad refuses to let her participate. And dad says, "This is my time, not hers. She already sees you more during the week. I'm not going to give up my weekends to gymnastics." So this might not be a 50-50 parenting time. This might be an every other weekend parenting time. I mean, I guess it could be 50-50 too. I just don't know. This is just kind of the example that we have. So what do you think about that legally? If it says that the parents have to agree, then in the parenting plan, then it has to, that it just is what it is. If he didn't agree, he doesn't agree. So Robert, what are your thoughts about that? If he's, and by the way, you can always go back and modify parenting plans, but there's time limits and it takes some time and you've got to do some stuff. But so what's in the best interest of the child, and what is, what's going on here? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties for co-parents in these situations is they're often thinking from the same framework as attorneys and judges because that's what they're primed for. So they're thinking in legal terms like parenting time and legal decision making, and they're not really looking through the perspective or eyes of the child. The child isn't calculating parenting time and keeping a ledger of I'm at mom's house or dad's house X number of hours. Ava, in this case, is thinking, why can't I do what I love? I want to do gymnastics. It makes no sense to me why I can't participate on dad's time or mom's time. And so the parents are often overlooking how their dispute or disagreement is affecting the kid emotionally.
So how important, let's go back kind of a little bit. How important do you think extracurricular activities are for kids?
They can be tremendously beneficial. I mean, there's different families that use resources differently. So extracurriculars aren't the only way to access certain positive benefits, but we do know from some of the literature that there are a lot of physical health benefits when kids participate, not just in sports, but regular physical activity, which sports could be a mechanism to deliver that, or any sort of organized sport or extracurricular activity. So you obviously see improvements in functional abilities with regular physical fitness, obviously weight management, reducing the risk of chronic illness. Those would just be some of the health benefits. But we also see some psychological benefits to extracurriculars. We've seen studies show correlations between positive self-esteem, confidence, reduce symptoms of anxiety and depression when kids are actively involved in organized sports or physical activity. We can also see social skill improvements, academic performance correlations that we've seen from some studies. So there's certainly benefits. We could also talk about drawbacks. There's physical injury that's a potential. And then the kind of risk here that might be less noticeable in families that aren't going through divorce, but the impact of parents having conflict in front of the child over sports or at sporting events or extracurricular activities. So we can argue benefits and drawbacks all day long, but if one or more of the family members has identified wanting to do some sort of extracurricular activity, it's definitely worth looking into.
One of the things that I have added in parenting plans is if a child has always been in this specific sport. For instance, if Ava had been in gymnastics since she was 5, she's been to like Olympic training, and she's really has a really good chance of maybe getting a college scholarship or going to the Olympics. Then we add that in there that the parents are going to do it. They agree that this has been there. And if for some reason one parent can't pay, then and the other parent chooses to pay, then they can, that kind of stuff, because it can be super expensive. The travel clubs can be super expensive. I know my daughter played travel hockey and she was on 2 teams. And it was a lot of travel. It was a lot of plane tickets, a lot of hotels. It was, not to mention ice time. It was super expensive. So if if the parents can't afford it, that's one thing. I don't, you certainly shouldn't go into the poorhouse so that a kid is playing, soccer. But if it's what the child's been doing, I think judges kind of like to keep it that way. And this is another reason why mediations are best, because if you can get all this in a mediation, then you can write it up exactly how you want it written up. Okay, this is another one. This one always, we have so many problems with this one, Robert. The parent coach conflict, right? Where a parent wants to be the coach. Sometimes I see this as just that's what the parent wants to do, and the parent has always been the coach during the marriage. But sometimes you see a parent newly wanting to be a coach and wanting to set practices on the other parent's parenting time as a way to control that, as a way to interfere. Alternatively, if there's 3 kids and say dad wants to coach and he can't coach on Tuesdays because he's got 2 other little kids to take care of, so he can't be away on that Tuesday coaching, that could be a reason and a problem. So what are your thoughts on a parent coaching?
Oh my gosh, Lonnie, this is such a layered, nuanced topic because there's so many perspectives and so many sort of context issues that relate to this very topic. So I like the first example you gave, whereby the parent has always been the coach. This is nothing new. They've been sort of the active parent involved in the athletics. Maybe they had a shared interest in athletics, so that was promoted throughout the early phase of the family. So nothing would change there except maybe the logistics of how that would work. And so that would be a harder argument to say, no, that parent should no longer be coaching. But when the coaching becomes more of a schedule issue versus a power struggle, that's where we get into some really unhelpful dynamics. And so some of the context that's really relevant here would be when we have families that are experiencing what we call parent-child contact problems, where the child or children are resisting or refusing contact with the parent. And then the coaching becomes a mechanism by which the parent either inserts themselves into the parenting schedule in a way that creates disagreement, or perhaps creates increased contact and control with the child. And so those, you can't really ignore those cues. And I'm sure there'll be families listening that meet that criteria, as well as other ones that are just trying to figure out the logistics of a parenting time schedule. Again, we're looking at it from the perspective of what could the child expect to have their needs met in this particular setting. So if they're happy in their athletics and a parent just happens to also be the coach and it's not creating many difficulties, I would encourage parents to really cooperate into finding solutions that build balance into making sure there's appropriate boundaries being set, similar to how if you had a parent who was a teacher and happened to have their own child in their class, you would have to have certain boundaries in place, just like you would in a coaching situation. But these require really probably balanced conversations as co-parents to know what the particular issues are in your circumstance. One of the other issues that comes up is just how that affects the parenting time schedule when it's not your time, and then is the other parent perceiving that coaching time as the other parent's parenting time. And Lonnie, I'm sure you've heard that as an argument too. So again, complex issues. You have to look at the history and the context and develop the boundaries that are going to be appropriate for your family.
Yeah, I've had that situation happen a couple of times, and what we typically, one of them, there was an order of protection, and so in that case, dad was coaching, mom had the order of protection, and so there was an issue with practices and taking to practices, and could mom go, and if mom went, did dad have to leave, and did dad have to leave it to the assistant coach? And so there's just things you need to write into your parenting plan if there's issues like that. And if there are issues, really try and address the issues. And for lack of a better way to say it, almost like the Constitution, right? You want to, it needs to be strict enough, but also loose enough that you can kind of work around some things. And it's tricky. That's why you hire lawyers to do that. If you don't have a lawyer, we do this on Split Up, right? We give people example language for parenting plans.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, again, from the child's perspective, they want to play their sport. They don't want to get involved in all the logistics of mom and dad not agreeing on who should be there. When you have a parent coach, if it's going to bring the conflict to the center of the child's experience, the family really needs to think long and hard about how that's going to impact and offset any potential benefits the extracurricular activity would otherwise have for that child, and say, look, this probably isn't worth it to put my child through this level of tension and conflict to have me be the coach. Maybe the more mature thing in that situation is for that parent to step down and just say, maybe we need to find a different team for you, or maybe I just don't coach anymore. And that's in the best interest of the child. But that requires putting the child's needs in front of your own desire to be involved in that capacity, even if maybe you've always been involved in that capacity.
Yeah, and we talked about this too. I think there are times where a parent has to step up and be the bigger person for the sake of the child. If you have one parent who's digging their heels in and maybe not doing what's best for the child or for the children, the other parent may have to step up and do what's right. And you're still required to be a good parent. And even if the other parent is kind of lacking on that job at that time. And I think that's important to mention, because sometimes, it would be really nice if we all worked together and played well together. But, after divorces, there's sometimes a lot of hurt feelings. There's sometimes a lot of resentment. When you go and watch, when a parent goes to watch their kid play and maybe the other parent drives up in a new Ferrari, and the other parent has a car that breaks down every 5 minutes, there's probably some resentment. And so when they're talking about, well, you're not paying half, well, maybe that parent can't pay half. But at some point, somebody's got to step up and be the bigger parent for the kids.
Right.
Right. Here's one. Well, what do you think about, and this was one that Robert and I disagreed on. What do you think about a parent going to practice, to watch the practice at the other parents, on the other parent's parenting day? So let's say dad takes child to practice. It's his parenting day. He takes the child to practice. Mom wants to come watch the practice. It's not her parenting day, but she wants to watch the practice.
So my perspective on that, if I were working with a family and this issue came up, would be that your child benefits when parents participate. So having either or both parents available for practices or games, especially games, but let's just go with the example of practices because they're probably lower of a priority. If the child wants a parent there and they feel uplifted by their presence and it's a positive, emotionally supportive environment for them, I would say that's centering the child's experience and needs. And parents should agree to that. And it doesn't detract from the parenting time parents' experience unless there's conflict. And more so, the impact, any negative impact from that would be upon the child. And if that's the case, if it does create a conflictual environment that detracts from the child's experience, only in those situations would I then say, well, then that's not worth it. And the parent just needs to stand down.
All right. So the way you say it, I can't disagree with. But I think, and maybe I'm just haven't been involved in something this big. When I took my daughter to ice hockey, I dropped her off a lot of the times. There were times I went and times that I didn't. And I've seen in my practice, parents use that time just to be jerks, right? Just to be there because they can when they know that there's a problem, to bring a girlfriend or a boyfriend to the game just to be a jerk. And so I don't like it. It's like, let the kid practice. It's not something that the parent really needs to participate in. It's not like this kid's in a game. I definitely think that both parents should be at games and at concerts and things like that. But I think a practice can be, it can be abused, showing up for practice. It can be used in such a way to torment the other parent. And I've seen that happen so many times. I just have a hard time jumping on board. Now, That being said, of course, if parents get along, that's wonderful. But I think for the most part, um, if there's a high conflict situation, there's zero reason in my mind for the non-custodial parent for that day to be at the practice. I just think it causes problems. So that being said, we both know we disagree on this, because we had this conversation earlier. Um, well, I think I don't think you disagree that if it's going to cause a problem, that they shouldn't show up.
Yeah, I think maybe where we differ is in our threshold of what the problem is. So even in a situation where there may be mild conflict that might be less detectable to the child, context matters here. And the example you gave of, abusing that time by trying to put yourself in front of the child or maybe a significant other, maybe not to directly, stoke the fire, but certainly to kind of make your presence known and kind of draw your line in the sand. These are a parent issue. These are not child issues. This is a parent who is not able to regulate their emotions, their sense of security, their own attachment relationship with their child to the degree that they feel they need to push into every minor activity so that they can make their appearance known. I would argue that's unhealthy from a psychological standpoint, if that is your intention. And in those instances, you really do need to kind of do your own work therapeutically to recognize how to set those healthy boundaries. Because when you do, you're also eliminating a conflict point with your co-parent. Because I would guess that the parent on the other end of that would have less concern if they didn't feel the parent was doing that for those reasons. If it truly were periodic, just to show support or kind of participate in your child's life. For example, I've heard the same argument with parents dropping by school during the other parent's parenting time to have lunch with the child. Again, in non-conflictual situations, that could be totally healthy and normal. You have to look at what the child is experiencing, and if they're detecting the conflict, it's probably not worth the risk. And that's where you as the parent need to do a risk benefit analysis. Is my presence here creating tension for the child? If so, is that going to offset the potential gains they would have from that activity? If the answer to that is yes, stand down.
Now, I think I might have to put you in the hot seat a little quicker, just because while you were talking about that. So we've got the where I like to, what did I call it? I'm trying to look for the name. What did we call it? In the hot seat with Dr. D. There it is.
Yeah,
I'm going to do that a little quicker because I think you made a really good point that a parent needs to pull themselves out of that situation. I actually, and we had this conversation again earlier today, I actually think that it's not necessarily a bad idea for the parent whose custodial time it is to pull themselves out of it. So if you've got an intrusive parent, if you've got a problem, if it's high conflict and you've got an issue with this parent, especially if there's been domestic violence in any way, even if there's not an order of protection, but if there's problems with this parent in general, and you know that there's going to be some kind of emotions or some kind of scene, or it's going to be super uncomfortable for your kids to be in the same place with you two parents at the same time in this situation, then I think you also have a duty to pull out. Go sit in your car for the hour. Go, watch a movie, read a book, whatever time you have, take that time and go away. And I know it's your parenting time, but again, I think at some points a parent needs to step up and be the better parent, even if it's not your fault. And even if you're not, especially if you're not the one screwing up and you're the only parent who can remedy it, I think we have a duty to do that as parents. What are your thoughts on that?
Lonnie, that is such a fantastic point and something I definitely advocate for when I'm working with parents, especially when I've identified one parent might be slightly more emotionally aware. And I hesitate to use the word stable, but able to assess the situation and put their own needs aside for the betterment of, the greater good. So that would be the parent that recognizes, I don't want to get into a power struggle with my co-parent. Clearly, this is really important to them to like show up and sort of mark their territory in a way. I'm not going to engage. It's like that metaphor of you can't have a tug of war if you're both holding on to the rope. And that would be that parent letting go of the rope and saying, I yield, you take the time. It was the time assigned to me for parenting time, if you want to look at it that way. But the other thing you're doing is you're gifting your child a tension-free event. And also you're gifting your co-parent time with the child that clearly is really important to them for whatever reason. And you're backing yourself out of the conflict. So it's a beautiful strategy if you have a very emotionally mature parent on the other end.
Yeah. And I've been through it. I know it can be hard, but I do think that can really work out. My phrase was always, I'm not going to let him change who I am. And I did that because it was like, I love my kids. I know what's best. I would try and tell myself that even if I had to bite it through my lip. Um, I think sometimes we have to step up for our kids. And
Yeah.
I think they appreciate that in the long run.
Well, and the other maybe psychological way to look at it, and I don't encourage sort of gamemanship, but in a way, you can walk away as the parent who sort of gets a gold star. You could sort of compliment yourself of like, hey, I did a good thing for my kid here. And you can do that silently. You don't have to make a deal out of it. The other co-parent may not even recognize what a solid you did everybody in the situation, but it's like making an anonymous donation. You can just kind of take that quietly and feel more just feel good about the decision that you made.
And if you can feel good about that decision that you make, and if that other parent was there for not nice reasons and just to aggravate you, they lose. They don't win that one because you don't care. You're just like, all right, you can have the time. And you give that to them, and all of a sudden now you don't have the issue. You don't have the problem with the struggle between like he's getting to me, he knows he's getting to me, he's purposefully getting to me. You
Absolutely.
literally take that away.
And the other potential gain that may or may not be realized is you've kind of put another you've made an investment in generosity in your co-parenting relationship that may be returned to you in another form from your co-parent. And so maybe when they feel less tense or like you're not engaging in the power struggle, you've role modeled to them that you're not going to be petty, you're not going to dig your heels in the sand, and then maybe they loosen up and they're a little bit more relaxed the next time you're all together.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And hopefully, I think anytime you can lower the conflict, it's better for the kids. So what about, and we have this happen sometimes where, we already talked about the my time. Um, but can we talk about a little bit about the emotional side of that with a child? Like, what is that child feeling when they've been practicing on mom's parenting time? And I'm sorry, I generalize because I'm a mom, and so it's just easier for me to say it that way. But it doesn't matter if it's mom or dad who's doing it. It happens to both of us. Both of them know there's not like moms are inherently great and dads are inherently bad. It's just this is how I'm saying it. If mom signs the child up for, say, soccer because practices are on her days, and then every other weekend the child goes to dad's, and the child has gone practice, practice, practice game, practice, misses, practice game, practice, misses. Does that have like, what does that do to the child?
Well, my first thought is obviously with organized sports and athletics, there's expectations to be part of a team, and you've made a commitment to follow through with whatever the objectives are for your team. And if you're missing games on a regular rotation, that's obviously going to impact the dynamics within your team and with your peers. And so they may feel the impact of that. They may feel tension with their coach, with their teammates. And that could have, an effect on them. It can make them feel less cohesion in their group. That can lead to, any number of, stress responses up to and including maybe feeling depressed or even just unmotivated to participate in the activity that they were maybe passionate about. So it could have some negative effects. Another potential outcome is that everybody just sort of accepts that their teammate is not available for that particular game and they adjust and acclimate to that. But I would think more often than not, you would see the first scenario, you would see it negatively impacting the child. And then you also have the child reconciling with the narrative around that. Like, why can't I go to my games, once a month or every other week? Like, that doesn't make sense to them. They're just passionate about the game. They don't care about mom and dad's conflict or the logistics around that. And so they internalize some of that potentially. They feel like, okay, this is my circumstance where I have two parents who don't agree. This is the collateral damage that I receive because mom and dad can't figure this out. And to some degree, that may happen in intact families too, in different circumstances. But kids typically, at least in my experience, when they talk about it with me, they identify, or rather they blame the divorce, or worse, they place the blame on one parent or the other. And in those situations, we create a potential pressure cooker for more resist refuse behaviors, where they start resisting a relationship, or the quality of the relationship between one parent and the child starts to deteriorate. And then we start seeing some of the negative outcomes that we know from high conflict dynamics and divorce.
All right, so I'm doing another on the hot spot with Dr. D because I have another question, and it's nothing that we talked about, but it's something that comes up in here, I think, a lot with extracurricular activities. Sometimes kids will tell one parent something and the other parent something completely different. And I don't want to say that they're lying, because I know they're just literally trying to sort of survive this dynamic, right? They're trying to figure out the best way to survive it. So what are your thoughts on that? And talk to the listeners and the parents about why does that happen?
Wait, Lonnie, are you suggesting that children don't always tell the truth in these situations and they may pit mom and dad against each other?
For some reason, sometimes they do.
Yeah. So this happens across the spectrum in intact families, separated and divorced families. So I want to start by saying that and normalize children will be self-serving and ego-driven depending on their age and development. They seek to get their needs met. And sometimes that means stretching the truth or exercising different perspectives in ways that can sometimes result in pitting mom and dad against each other. The difficulty that we see in these dynamics is that when you have a two household family, those sort of mistruths or misleading statements amplify those conflicts, because mom and dad in a high conflict situation don't have the communication skills to combat that, what we call triangulation, sort of pitting mom and dad against each other. And depending on how severe the co-parenting relationship has deteriorated, kids will sometimes inadvertently trigger bigger conflicts, or they use that as a tool in their tool belt of many tools, the children that is, to get their needs met. And so they may tell mom one thing about the schedule, hoping that it'll get back to dad, or vice versa. Or they'll make a statement about their wishes about sports or athletics. And keep in mind, children are not operating from kind of a global perspective or with the same insight and perspectives that adults have. So they're looking through more of a childlike lens. Their methods aren't going to be as sophisticated. So when the parent receives the misinformation, it absolutely will lead to confusion and conflict between the parents. And then they're off to the races, and it becomes a he said, she said, and everybody leans in and digs into their perspective and believing they know what the child's wishes are. And you can apply this to any high conflict situation or conflict in these families. It doesn't just have to be extracurriculars, but this becomes the area that promotes what I've mentioned a couple times with these parent-child contact problems, where you start developing unhealthy alliances or alignments between one parent and one child, or any combination thereof. And it does get really hard to unwind.
All right, so I have, now that we wanted to give some tips to some of the listeners about this. So the tips that I have, one is try and be specific in your parenting plan. You can't always create the best parenting plan, but you want to try and create a good parenting plan that's specific to your child's needs, with the understanding that your child's needs may change. And I say that with the understanding that you can always agree to do something different than what's in your parenting plan, but your parenting plan can be a fallback in the event that you can't agree to do something different. You want that fallback. So it's helpful to make it pretty specific in some areas. If your kids are in extracurricular activities, then make sure that you address that in a way that works for your family. Communicate through neutral tools. There are co-parenting apps that can help people communicate. If there's arguing, if there's name calling, then Propercom edits messages, and they actually edit out the abuse and only send the appropriate things. If you're trying to schedule things like games and the practices and trying to communicate with that, Our Family Wizard is great for that. There's a couple of other ones, but keep that in mind. You can schedule on those, and then stick to the agreements as much as you can. Of course, there's always going to be times where changes need to come in. But for the most part, you want to try and stick to the plans so that it's not frustrating the other parent. It's not frustrating the kid. It's not putting the kid in the middle. And by the way, if you change the plan, don't change it through the child. Talk to the other parent. Let's not put the kids in the middle of changing plans, especially when it comes to their activities. Parents need to communicate about that. And listen, that's always in all my parenting plans, and it never fails that somebody's like, he's talking to the kids or she's talking through the kids. Just stop it. Just don't do that. Talk to the other parent, put it in an email. Plus, as a lawyer, I want that. I want that info. I want to be able to see that and use that in court if we need to go there next time, that you're communicating appropriately about changes or things like that. If you don't have that evidence and somebody's trying to go in and say that you're not telling them things, all of a sudden you have no evidence for that. So if you agree on an activity, keep your word. This is for the kids, not for the other parent. Even if that other parent is living vicariously through the kid, it's still the kids. So Robert, do you have any tips?
Yeah, Lonnie, those were great tips. I would just add to that, really focusing and centering the child here. So asking yourself, is this what's best for my child? Or being aware of whether you're in a mindset of trying to win against the other parent or putting your needs above the child's needs, because you've already been set up in a divorce for an adversarial mindset, this winner loser mentality and, trying to get your needs met. And that's not always bad. You should advocate for yourself and get your needs met, but we don't ever want to make that at the expense of the kids. The other thing we want to keep in mind is, depending on your child's age and development and where they're at in that timeline, you're really trying to, over their life course, encourage their independence and support and foster them, differentiating and separating from mom and dad. One of the ways they can do that is through activities and connections with peers. And as we've been discussing, extracurricular activities or athletics. Support those activities that help your child grow, even if they happen during the other parent's time. You've got to shift your mindset. It's not your time or their time. It's, what is the long-term big picture for my child? They're going to look back, and you don't want their memories to be, I couldn't do this or do that because mom and dad couldn't figure out something as silly as a schedule. So keep that in perspective when you're fighting with yourself in your own mind about whose time it is. And I know, the practicality of, sometimes parenting time is directly correlated with financial support, and that makes it really difficult. But ultimately, you're really trying to center your child's needs and their relationship with both parents. And that relationship needs to be a healthy, strong relationship with both parents who wish to be involved. And then the third tip I'd mention is just one, having good emotional regulation skills on board for yourself so that you can role model those to your child. So it's a double benefit. One, you're engaging in emotional regulation tools, cognitive tools, so that you can stay present and not escalate situations, like the example we gave before of being the better one and like backing out of the conflict. But also doing that in an emotionally regulated way, but staying calm and problem solving and doing that in front of your child when necessary will help them learn conflict resolution skills to approach disagreements, not with avoidance or lashing out or overreactivity, but really strong conflict resolution skills that are healthy.
All right. So I should have mentioned that when I said take yourself out of the conversation or out of the the area. Don't go running to your car, screaming, yelling, you know, peeling out of the parking lot. For sure, don't do that. Don't make a scene when you're leaving. You just quietly back out of the situation, and if you have a problem with the other person staying there.
Do that once you get home and the kids aren't around.
Yeah, there you go. You can scream into your pillow.
Yeah.
So managing extracurricular activities in high conflict situations can be challenging, but it is possible. You try and get your parenting plan as you know, as thorough as possible that fits your family, with the understanding that those needs are very likely going to change. And if you can really just put your child first, putting your child first, even if the other parent can't, is really important. And at times you have to be the bigger parent and do that.
And also don't forget, these activities really should be enriching your kid's life, not being the source of conflict. So focus on what truly benefits them.
And if you're struggling with navigating any of these issues, check out our app Split Up. There are resources and tips for effective co-parenting in all different areas, not just the divorce and separation, but after the divorce and separation on co-parenting.
All right. See you next time. Thanks, Lonnie.